Well, hey there. Welcome to week 6. This is our wrap up, our grand finale, the conclusion of our Bib 438. And for week 6, as we move into it, we're going to open up a few new wrinkles as we get ready to wind up the class. First wrinkle, you probably will notice as we move through this week. Up till this point, the first 5 weeks, we have had a very heavy emphasis on getting to understand the Bible and how it's fit, focusing a lot on the Old Testament with a little bit of New Testament sprinkled in. This week for week 6, we're going to focus entirely on the New Testament. Part of that is because so much, a majority of the biblical material we have in our Bible is in the Old Testament. And it's also the most unfamiliar part to us, so we spend a lot of time in the class on that particular area. The other thing that we tend to focus on in this class, as well as the other Bib class that you may have already taken, the Bib 314, because the focus of Bib 314 is almost exclusively on the New Testament, primarily on the life of Jesus as we see depicted in the Gospel of Matthew. We kind of stay away from most of the Gospels, a little bit of Gospel thrown in here and there, because we know you have that foundation already as we begin to elaborate and give you a broader picture of the whole of the Bible. But this week we're going to be focusing on the New Testament, and in the New Testament we're going to be focusing on a new genre, something we haven't seen before. We've talked about various biblical genres, the narrative, the poetry, the wisdom literature, the prophetic materials, lots of different types of material, and each of those genres have their own rules for interpretation. And so we will look primarily this week at something we call the New Testament letters. The New Testament is made up of some narrative sections, the Gospels and the book of Acts, for example, but mostly of letters, correspondence from that first century, from early church leaders to churches or individuals that we still retain about what does it mean for that individual or that church to properly represent Christ, to be the church in that early New Testament period. And from that, we can begin to take some lessons about what it means for us to be Christians in our contemporary age. But these were letters written in that first century. As I said, the majority of the New Testament, at least in the number of books, there are 27 books in the New Testament, and the vast majority of those 27 are going to be letters. And about half of the material in the New Testament, half the books in the New Testament, are going to be letters written by a certain individual. His name was Paul, or Paul the Apostle. The Apostle Paul wrote 13 different letters that we have contained in the New Testament. So again, almost half of the books in the New Testament were written by Paul. So that really makes him probably next to Jesus, who, the Gospels are all about, most influential person in the New Testament because he did the majority of the writing, and majority of the teaching and sharing the gospel, spreading the gospel into the known world at that time. And certainly what we have held on to as the Bible has his fingerprints all over it. So it's a new genre. Again, 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament would be considered letters of Paul. And so we'll be looking at those. The first one is in the book of Romans. We get introduced to Paul in the book of Acts. In the very next book is the beginning of that section of letters, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and on through, until you get to the book of Philemon. Philemon, of course, is the letter that we're going to be studying and working out for our signature assignment. And it's a great little snapshot into Paul's personality and a little bit of his influence and some of the priorities of his work. So we'll set Philemon aside just for now, because I know you'll be coming back to look a lot at it. And as we think about Philemon there sitting on the side, is going to kind of lead us into our topic for this week. And the topic for this week has to do with worth and status. Worth is a tricky thing, isn't it? We sometimes use those words almost interchangeably, but yet they really do mean different things. How much has a person worth? Does somebody have more worth than another because of their value to a company, a team, a staff? Are there some people compared to others who you might say is worth more? Yeah, in that context, you might say so. There may be a player with more talent. You say that they are worth more to their team than player B. Or you might say in a company, the president has more worth than the person who is at the very bottom of the scale. But if we're going to define the word worth using kind of biblical terminology, I would like to suggest to you that worth really defines who we are in value terms through the eyes of God. Okay? And because we'll see that as you walk through, there's a couple of assignments that will take you through various New Testament passages. And wherever you see this idea of value in the eyes of God, which each of us have, we recognize that all of us have a very significant worth. In fact, no one is worth more. No one is worth less. Regardless of your skills, regardless of your place, regardless of your role, regardless of your abilities, it all comes down to, because in the eyes of God, you're a child of God, that each and every one of us have equal worth. This plays into the story of Philemon. Remember, Philemon comes out of this idea of somebody who is a slave, so therefore is deemed as being less worthy or having less worth than those who were owners or masters of those slaves. And really, how could you own somebody if you didn't think of them as being less than? So in that culture where worth was kind of tied up in what you did, the Bible stands in stark contrast because it wants to see us and allow us to see through that prism that worth is really defined by God himself as he then grants it to us. Now, status is different, and status is not the same as worth. In fact, people in relationship with others can have different statuses. You can have a leader, you can have a follower. You can have a person at the top of the food chain, you have people at the bottom of the food chain. You can have those who interact with one another and they fill different roles. And because of those different roles, be it relational roles or in a corporate setting roles, that they have different responsibilities and different status. So someone could have a higher status than someone with lower status. But again, looking through this lens of worth, each would have equal worth. And that does change how we see one another, and it should shape how we treat one another. I mean, how appropriate in the context of what's going on in our world around us right now. The challenge of calling that we want a greater sense of equality, and that equality is comes out of this rooting, this very biblical rooting, that we all have the same worth in the eyes of God. So these ideas of status and worth are going to be interesting kind of interplay throughout this week 6 as we look at the New Testament through this lens, and especially as we prepare to jump into the challenge of status and worth in the book of Philemon. Who's got the status? What's Paul's status? Does Philemon's status change if he releases this grudge he holds against Onesimus? Does Onesimus' status change? As he once was a slave, now is a runaway, and could he be either forgiven for that or even freed for that? Again, completely other statuses, but all of that being rooted in the sense of our worth. So hold on to those thoughts as you open up this week 6, and we will finish well together. Okay? See you Wednesday.